They were in luck, as the other four proved easy to find. They found Fluttershy and Rarity first, in the spot where Rarity had seemed to spend most of her time these days. Ever since Sweetie Belle had died, Rarity hadn't known really what to do with herself anymore. Her drive for fashion seemed to have temporarily evaporated, and she spent her time on petty things that didn't demand too much of her, the spa being first among them. Fluttershy had already experienced the string of death multiple times in her capacity as an animal caretaker, and had proven to be remarkably resilient in this respect. Sometimes life wasn't fair, and you could only accept it and move on. Due to Fluttershy's continued support, Rarity was steadily recovering, and Twilight didn't doubt she'd be back to making dresses before the week was over. Applejack likewise failed to surprise them. She was busy bucking apples when they found her. Her method of dealing with grief was exactly opposite of Rarity's. Instead of distancing herself from her work, she drowned herself in it, probably so that she didn't have time to think about anything else. Outwardly, she'd never shown any signs of grief at all, except for the tears shed at the funeral, and Twilight wasn't too worried about her. She knew there was no obstacle that Applejack could overcome, and even something as big as this would hardly slow her down. She probably saw it as her duty to work even harder for Apple Bloom's sake, and Twilight could understand that, somewhat. They didn't find Rainbow Dash, but Rainbow Dash found them. She was lounging on some clouds when she spotted her friends galloping past, so came down to investigate. Strangely enough, Rainbow Dash had perhaps worried Twilight the most during the first few days. She seemed to do everything in a higher gear and with more intensity than most ponies, including grieving as well. The day after the incident, she just smashed about every part of the theater until she had been standing out of pure frustration. And even that hadn't been enough to cool her rage. However, the next day she seemed to have traded anger for depression, but she got over that a few days later as well. Twilight wondered how much Pinkie Pie had had to do with that. "So, tell us again, Twi," Applejack said as they approached the Everfree Forest. "Twist showed you some things from the theater because she suspected foul play, and she was supposed to come over today so you could tell her she was right, but she didn't show. So you used that fancy spell of yours to find her, but it failed, and now we're going where exactly?" "It didn't fail. That's the point," Twilight replied. "It was blocked." "Blocked, dear?" Rarity asked in turn. "Yes, you see, the magic of spells can't reach you if it can't tell where you are," Twilight explained. I'm not sure why it took them so long to grasp the concept. "I think the only one place that could prevent magic from reaching Twist." "And that is?" Rainbow asked as she swooped in closer. "Well, after we defeated Nightmare Moon, I became incredibly interested in historical reports from around the time of her banishing, roughly 1,000 years ago. It has some books on the subject brought here from Canterlot." Twilight paused to see if every pony was still following along, and they nodded to indicate that that was the case. You see, Nightmare Moon didn't get banished right away. There was a war between her and Princess Celestia, the so-called Nightmare Rebellion. Nightmare Moon's supporters were few, but she had some incredible powerful unicorns at her disposal. In order to fight back against Celestia's far greater army, they used dark magic to construct a hidden fortress in a few key locations. They built them in such a way that their own magic would be empowered, but the unicorns faithful to Celestia couldn't even levitate a speck of dust in there. "Sounds scary," Fluttershy said meekly. Twilight nodded. "Quite. At any rate, most of these fortresses have been taken apart. But around here, there's one that's always been remote enough that no pony was bothered by it. And in an area dangerous enough that no pony felt like going near it, anyway." "The Everfree Forest?" Pinkie ventured a guess. Twilight nodded once more as she increased the pace. "I've got a bad feeling about this," Spike said woefully as his spot on Twilight's back. But, as was often the case, he was largely ignored. They finally arrived in front of some massive stone doors, and every pony looked around in awe, thoroughly impressed. "Something like this was all the way out here? All along?" Rainbow Dash said incredulously. "And we didn't even realize it?" "I don't exactly see you coming all the way out here that often, darling." "Now, hold on, y'all," Applejack tried to calm down the others. "How do we get inside?" They all stopped and stared at Twilight, who smiled sheepishly. "Well, there's supposed to be a key of some description, but only one per fortress. So," she said with an uncertain tone in her voice, "I suppose I could try to force the doors open." Applejack frowned. "I thought you said you couldn't use your magic in there." "That's not what she said, you silly Willy," Pinkie exclaimed. "She said it doesn't work inside, but she's outside, right? Right?" "Right," Twilight agreed. "Stand back." They all retreated as far back as they could, and even Spike jumped off her back in order to take cover behind a few rocks. Twilight gritted her teeth. Surely her track records for spells wasn't that bad. There have been the Parasprites, true, but she shook her head, and concentrated on the task at hoof. She increased her focus, and magical energy began to gather in her horn, waiting to be shaped. Twilight wouldn't need much finesse this time around. With a grunt, she increased her efforts even more. The entire area was bathed in a pulsating glow of her horn. She kept gathering more power until she felt she really couldn't hold any longer. The discharge of raw magical energy hit the doors like a battering ram, and they were blown right off the hinges. A cloud of dust rose up, and Twilight wouldn't be surprised if she later found out that the explosion had been heard all the way back in Canterlot. She panted with exhaustion as her friends slowly left their hiding places. Is it over?" Fluttershy peeked out from behind a half-collapsed wall, shaking all over. "Well, I'll be Twi. I knew you had it in you, just not that it was this much." Meanwhile, Rainbow Dash and Rarity finally realized they had jumped onto each other's embrace in the heat of the moment. They let go of each other and sheepishly put some distance between themselves, hoping no pony had noticed. "Ooh! There's a light in here!" Pinkie's voice came floating from inside. Twilight sighed. At least there was one pony whose natural curiosity had overcome her sense of danger. Now that Pinkie was inside, the others quickly overcame their initial anxiety, and soon all 7 of them were standing at the entrance hall, mumbling amongst themselves about the peculiar lighting conditions inside. 3 hallways connected to the entrance hall to the rest of the fortress. 1 in each wall besides the one they've come through. No pony seemed to know which one to take, and they all looked at each other for suggestions. "Look what I found!" Pinkie Pie said cheerfully, as she turned towards Twilight, revealing a pair of glasses currently resting on her nose. They were way too small for her head, and the overall effect was rather comical. "Pinkie, what did you find that, dear?" Rarity asked. Pinkie Pie nodded towards the center of the room. "Just on the floor over there." The others nodded at each other. "Right. So now we're certain that Twist's here," Twilight said. "But we don't know how she got here, or why she's here. There could be some pony else around, and according to my book, these fortresses were littered with traps. So, be careful, okay?" She paused for a moment until every pony, even Pinkie, had voiced their approval. "We need to find her as soon as possible. Fluttershy and Applejack, you take the hallway to the left. Pinkie and Rainbow Dash, the middle one. Rarity, you're with me and Spike. Every pony ready?" They all nodded once again, slightly more grim this time, as they all realized party time was over. "Come back here when you cover your side. All right? Let's go." And so the group split up and headed in the direction they'd been assigned to, unaware that each passage led to the same destination. Cheerilee woke up with a start, as the sounds of a violent explosion ripped through the complex. She looked around in confusion for a few moments, but then it all came back to her. She was in an abandoned fortress, and judging by the sounds of that explosion, Twilight Sparkle had indeed found them. Cheerilee got up on her hooves and threw a glance into the adjacent room, checking out on Twist's condition. The filly hung limply in her bonds, and Cheerilee couldn't see if her chest was rising or falling from where she was standing. She let out a sigh of disappointment. Twist hadn't made it. She struggled as she started to make her way towards the entrance hall, sticking to the secret passages. She had no way of knowing for sure if Twilight had come along alone or not, so she needed to be careful. She didn't feel like getting into a fight with Applejack nor Rainbow Dash. Not a fair fight, anyway. Luckily, she held the home turf advantage. She wasn't sure how she'd bring the intruders to justice, but she knew that she would. It was just a matter of finding them and leading them into one of the traps. Any location would do, really. They all had nasty surprises in store. Cheerilee almost cackled with excitement as she tried to come up with a mental list of interesting ways to put an end to the 6 or so ponies. She had almost reached her destination when she became aware of a pair of voices drawing near. She stopped and looked down the hallway that was adjacent to the secret passage she was in. There was a lot less light in the inner sanctum than there was in the maze, so she didn't have to worry too much about being discovered. Any pony looking up would see nothing but darkness beyond the metal bars in the wall. Do we really have to do this? Fluttershy shuddered as she looked around skittishly. Applejack stopped and put a hoof on her friend's shoulder. I know you're scared, Sugar Cube, but we've got to hang in there. There's a little filly counting on us, and hey, I'm here to keep you safe. So, what do you say? Fluttershy smiled uncertainly. All right. I'll try for Twist. For Twist, Applejack agreed. They continued on their way, and Cheerilee followed them in secret. It seemed Twilight had indeed brought her friends along, which was very fortunate indeed. It'd only take one fell swoop to wipe them all off the map, but it had to be done delicately. She'd have to take care not to reveal herself too soon. One mistake could quickly spell ruin for the entire plan, and she wouldn't be able to return to Ponyville if she was discovered here. I feel like we're being watched, Fluttershy said meekly, as they rounded another corner, causing Cheerilee to back away from the wall with a start. Old buildings like this will do that to you, Applejack said dismissively. Cheerilee breathed a sigh of relief that had nearly given her a heart attack. She needed to get started, and fast. But how could she... A plan had materialized in her head, as Applejack and Fluttershy turned left at the next split in the path, drawing closer to the room Twist was in. Twilight and her friends were powerful opponents, and rumors of their exploits had spread throughout the land on numerous occasions. However, this also made them vulnerable. Every pony in Ponyville knew their strengths and characteristics, and those could easily be turned into their weaknesses. All she had to do was guide them into a situation where their reactions could be easily predicted, and from there on out, she would dictate the scene. She skipped ahead of the pair, galloping towards the room she'd spent the night in, throwing several switches along the way. The maze silently rearranged itself into the form that she dictated, until Fluttershy and Applejack only had one option left. She pulled down a lever, and a heavy door to Twist's room slid open. Everything was in position. She couldn't be sure if it'd work, but it wasn't a big loss even if it didn't. She had an innumerable amount of options still open to her. She heard Fluttershy and Applejack approach once more, the sounds of their whoos echoing on stone. Cheerilee grinned. They weren't even trying to be silent. Not that it'd have done them much good anyway. They rounded the last corner, and Twist was suddenly in full view, cuffed to the wall opposite the open door. They couldn't make out her exact condition from where they were standing, but they could tell it wasn't good. "Twist!" Fluttershy yelled, as her maternal instincts, honed for perfection from years of caring for little animals, took over, compelling her to rush at the filly's aid right away. Applejack stood dumbfounded for a moment, shocked by their sudden discovery. She gave chase as soon as she came to her senses, but there was no way she could catch up to Fluttershy anymore. "No, wait! Some pony obelisk did this to her. I don't trust it." But it was too late. Cheerilee triumphantly pushed the lever as Fluttershy passed the door several meters ahead of Applejack, and it instantly slid back into place. Applejack only barely managed to slow down enough to stop herself from being crushed headfirst into the door, and she immediately started pounding on it with her front hooves. "Fluttershy! Fluttershy! Are you okay?" "I'm okay. I'll look after Twist. Try to get the door open, please," Fluttershy answered calmly. Twist needed her right now. She couldn't afford to be scared. Applejack grunted. She still didn't like the situation, or how that door had just moved on its own. But there was nothing she could do. She began looking for a way to open it, pushing against every part of the wall, and turning over every stone on the ground. And Cheerilee saw her do it, but wasn't too worried. The only way to open it was from the hallway, half back through the hallway. And it'd be some time before Applejack even started to look there. She walked into the room she'd slept in, and enjoyed the spectacle. Fluttershy rushed to the filly's aid, and tears started to fill her eyes as she saw what kind of condition she was in. Her fur was blood-caked and filthy, and she just kind of hung from the wall as if all strength had left her body. For a moment, Fluttershy even thought she was dead, but then she noticed the slight rising and falling of her chest. She was alive, but only just. Fluttershy caressed the filly's cheek gently, and Twist tried to open her eyes. She didn't seem strong enough to open them completely, and the sight once again brought tears to Fluttershy's eyes. Fluttershy, is that you? Twist said weakly. It was barely more than a hoarse whisper, but Cheerilee drew in a breath of surprise. The runt had made it. She'd hoped she would, but she'd never actually believed. Cheerilee's face split into a wicked grin. Twist's will to live would only make this more amusing. It was going to get interesting, indeed. Shh. It's okay. It's okay. I'm here, and I'll get you out. Promise. Save your strength, Fluttershy said, consolingly, as she tried to find a way to open the rings that held Twist in place. Twist coughed up some blood. No youth, and they woke, and Cheerilee. Shh. It's not important right now, Twist. It can wait, Fluttershy said as she started to pull on the rings. What was she trying to say, anyway? Something about cherries? Deep inside Twist's belly, a host of newly formed beetles woke up. Their post-metamorphosis nap disturbed by the presence of another living creature. And they were a sickly hue of green, and a lot more mean-looking than most insects their size. Curiously enough, they had a poison stinger just underneath their mandibles, and their legs ended in sharp spikes that made it easy to walk over slippery surfaces, such as blood, inside the unfortunate ponies. The back of their shields carried the spikes as well, possibly to discourage larger creatures from chomping on them. It was hard to imagine any creature willingly taking one of these into their mouths, but then again, the Everfree Forest was a savage place indeed. As far as Cheerilee was concerned, their only shortcoming was their inability to fly. That wasn't unheard of amongst beetles, but it still bummed her out somewhat. At the same time, it was also the only reason she even dared come this close to them, mosquito net or not. Twist let out a guttural groan as they started to skitter about, intent on breaking free from their host. With their sharp mandibles, they cut into Twist's flesh, eating themselves a way out, their legs clawing at a bloody path towards freedom. The filly shrieked, and Fluttershy gasped as she saw her stomach bulge out in several places.
Twist? What's wrong? Hang in there! Twist!
She said, panicked, desperately trying to get the filly free, as if that would be the solution to all problems. Twist tried to repeat her earlier warning, despite the mind-numbing pain she was in, but she only managed a choked mumble. Some of the beetles had apparently decided that digging away through Twist's belly wasn't the only way out, and they crawled upwards through her body. She felt several of them climb up her throat, shredding her windpipe and esophagus with their sharp spikes lying on the back of their shields and on the ends of their legs. Twist's eyes rolled back at her head as the first beetle victoriously emerged from her mouth and coughed out a torrent of blood along with bits and pieces of her tongue. Fluttershy jumped back in surprise as splatters of blood rained down upon her, and the beetle fell to the ground. Twist's body spasmed violently as her stomach burst open, and a wave of beetles had left her in a sea of blood and gore, soon joined by the ones who had taken the path up through her throat. Cheerilee reveled in the sight. She had been looking forward to it, but not even in her wildest dreams had she dared hope it would be as beautiful as this. The twitches and convulsions wrecked Twist's body, only adding to the spectacle, and Cheerilee felt something in her stomach melt with excitement as the filly's body slowly became still. Fluttershy was paralyzed with fright for a few moments, her mind unable to process what had just happened. She stared at the bloody mess that had been Twist only a few moments ago, and her mind almost snapped under the weight of reality. She backed away as fast as she could, screaming her lungs out in a way that made the Royal Canterlot voice seem like a foal's whispers. The Everfree beetles clicked their mandibles and drew near, undisturbed. "Fluttershy?" Applejack yelled. "Fluttershy!" She began pounding on the door with her hind hooves, putting years of apple bucking to good use in an attempt to break down the door with strength alone. She wasn't getting anywhere, though, and Cheerilee let her bang to her heart's content. Those doors had been built to withstand an army. There was no way one pony would bring them down. The beetles kept approaching their new prey, Fluttershy, and she was slowly being forced into a corner. She continued to scream as she tried to unfurl her wings, but pure fear seemed to have glued them shut against her back. "Applejack! Save me! Applejack!" "I'm coming!" Applejack yelled back with more confidence than she was feeling, as she continued to wail away at the door. Fluttershy shrieked as the first beetle tried to climb up her leg, but she quickly crushed him under her hoof. More kept coming, determined to make her their next meal. She flattened as many as she could, wildly stomping down upon the wave of insects with reckless abandon, but there were always more to take their fallen's place. Eventually, one of the beetles managed to grab hold of her front leg, and she shook it wildly in an effort to make it let go. She succeeded, but her plan backfired, as multiple beetles climbed up the legs she had been neglecting to move. She began to jump up and down, bucking her legs out wildly. She managed to throw some beetles off, but others proved far more persistent She let out a yelp as one of the beetles stung her on her left front leg, and she quickly brushed it off with a hoof. Cheerilee smiled gleefully as she saw the skin around the infected insect bite quickly turn an angry red color. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Cheerilee moaned in pain as the flesh above her left front hoof swelled at an alarming rate, expanding until it was easily 1.5 times its usual circumference. A stabbing pain radiated up from her leg every time the hoof hit the ground, making her breathe in sharply as spots appeared in front of her eyes. The swollen skin suddenly burst open without alarm, spattering blood and gore all over the floor, and leaving bits of a big oozing hole in her leg. It was as if part of her flesh had exploded, and the rest seemed to be melting away. She cried out in pain, and several of the beetles made use of the momentary distraction to latch on as well, stinging her legs in greater number of places. Applejack heard Fluttershy's screams change in tone from panic to outright pain, and she redoubled her efforts. Her hooves started to crack, and little chips of chitin were soon jumping away left and right. But she didn't care. She kept going, desperately kicking the door, even as blood started to well up around her hooves. Meanwhile, Fluttershy's legs were swollen all over, and she sobbed heartbreakingly with every movement she made. The swellings burst open one after the other, scattering the contents of her legs all over the floors and wall, until they resembled a bloodier version of a crater-ridden moon landscape. Keeping the beetles at bay had started to become an excruciating task, and heaps of them were now climbing up her legs, digging their spikes into her naked flesh. In many places, her bones had been completely exposed, and the yellow color of her skin became increasingly rare compared to the red of her blood and flesh. She started to feel lightheaded, and slowly started to sway from side to side. Cheerilee began to take bets out against herself, trying to guess how much longer Fluttershy would manage to remain standing. She couldn't reach an internal consensus, but even her most optimistic guess remained quite grim for the mare involved. All of a sudden, Fluttershy felt herself lose her grip on the floor, which had become slippery with her blood. She tried to stabilize herself by quickly putting her right hoof down, but that proved to be a costly mistake. Her right leg wasn't able to carry her weight in its weakened condition, and her hoof just snapped clean off, leaving her with a sharp piece of bone sticking out in a bloody stump. She wailed like a banshee as she fell to the ground, breaking one of her hind legs in the process. She rolled over onto her back, and her vision blurred as pain flooded her senses. More beetles were crushed under her weight, their tiny spikes raking against her back and sides, to add to the already significant pool of blood she was lying in. More beetles finally saw their chance, and within moments they were crawling all over her. "No!" she screamed, as she desperately tried to brush them off, sobbing loudly as it became increasingly difficult to force herself to bear the pain and move her legs at all. Her legs finally collapsed beside her, as the beetle poison blew out the last of her muscles to shreds and reduced them to bloody lumps of flesh, thinly spread around her exposed bones. Applejack panted, sweat dripping down her body. Kicking the door had thoroughly ruined her hooves by now, and she turned around to start punching instead. Her kicks had left clear marks upon the door, and she tried to give herself new hope by imagining that she only needed to go a bit further. She knew in reality she had probably only barely chipped the surface, but she couldn't let herself believe that right now. Her friend needed her, and she didn't know what else to do. Hang in there, Fluttershy. I'm coming, she panted in between her punches. Fluttershy felt the beetles sting her all over, agony quickly spreading through her body. The skin around her belly button first swelled up and then burst open, a stream of blood running down her sides, as several beetles dug their mandibles into her exposed flesh, clawing at her insides. One beetle climbed up to her face, coming to rest on her right cheek, just underneath her eye.
Please. No. Please,
she whispered in tears, her throat hoarse and bloodied from all the screaming. Agonizing pains racked her body, but she didn't dare move for fear of antagonizing the beetles on her head. Her valiant effort proved to no avail, as the beetles stung her anyway. Within seconds, the entire right side of her face was grotesquely swollen, as if some pony had turned her head into a balloon. Her right eye was soon swollen shut, and every breath she took came accompanied by a pain so intense she wished she were dead. The beetles on her stomach had finally found the treasure trove, and they poured in through a newly created hole en masse, descending upon her intestines like a rabid pack of wolves upon a succulent piece of meat. They began to devour her intestines like they had twists the night before. But this time, their eating habits were completely different. Instead of tunneling their way through, the way the larvae had, they cut her apart with their mandibles. To Fluttershy, it felt like 100 scissors were ripping her apart. And that was without accounting for the constant torment caused by the spines on her back, which raked the inside of her belly as they moved about. She now sobbed incessantly, not strong enough to keep crying or screaming without end anymore. Just feeding her intestines through a meat grinder would probably have been a lot less painful. Her cheek finally burst, and she managed to let out more primal screams, as her definition of the worst pain possible got updated yet again. Blood spattered across her face, getting into her eyes and nose, along with small pieces of skin and flesh. She tried to open her right eye, but quickly closed it again, as the pieces of gore stuck in it made the attempt rather unbearable. One beetle, perhaps the same one from before, saw the gaping hole in her cheek as a golden opportunity to climb into her mouth. Fluttershy felt his claws pierce her tongue, and desperately attempted to spit him out as blood started running down her throat. The beetle would have none of it, and instantly stung her right in the tongue, just before she managed to expel him. It quickly swelled up, becoming so large that it hung partially out of her mouth. Her breathing became incredibly labored, and combined with the loss of blood, the excruciating pain, it was almost completely enough to make her lose consciousness there and there. Her swollen tongue burst open, and it was by far the bloodiest wound she had suffered yet, even as the beetles carved up her intestines and nibbled at her lungs. Hot blood started filling her mouth, running down her throat and chin, along with the scattered pieces of what had once been her tongue. She tried to spit it all out, but she no longer had the power to lift her head, and so it became incredibly hard to do so. A blind panic swept her, and swept away the last of her rationality as she tried to scream once more. Even if the blood hadn't been there, it'd probably have amounted to nothing more than a coarse whimper. But, as it stood, she only managed to let out a disgusting gurgling sound. Her body started to shake and spasm in a last-ditch effort to get everything under control, but it was in vain. Fluttershy felt her lungs burn, screaming for the oxygen her mangled, drained body so desperately needed. But all it got instead was a steady flow of blood running down the wrong pipe. Insofar as there was even one left. Her remaining bodily functions ceased one by one, and the darkness wrapped her in its cold embrace, after a last, desperate gurgle. Cheerilee stood, glued to her spot, just behind the bars, her tongue hanging slightly from her mouth as she panted, as if it allowed her to taste the misery of her last victim. She closed her eyes to commit Fluttershy's final moments to memory, and just thinking about it sent another shiver down her spine. Applejack was still pounding on the door, but every punch became slower and slower, as tears streamed down her face. She hadn't heard Fluttershy in a while, and she was quite sure she knew what that meant. "Come on, Shy," she said between sobs. "Don't you dare give up on me. You hear?" She landed one more punch, and then leaned her forehead against the door. Her hooves pressed up against her face, as her shoulders shook violently. "Don't you die on me. You can't leave me, Shy," she stuttered. She allowed her body to slowly slide down to the floor, tears running down her cheeks, as she kneeled down on the cold stone. The very image of a broken mare. "You can't leave me like this," she yelled, as she rammed one of her front hooves into the floor, and then curled up to a ball as she cried. "Oh, Fluttershy. Not you two."